all started innocently enough. At least that's what I try to tell myself. I walk my dog, Rusty, every morning before work. He's a big, fluffy golden retriever, always full of energy, so our morning strolls are an essential part of our routine. We had been following the same route for nearly a year, around their neighborhood, past the park, a little on Oak Street, then looping back home. It was safe, quiet, and familiar. But then I noticed him. It was a few months ago, on a chilly morning in early spring. As I passed by one of those houses along Maple Avenue, I felt a pair of eyes on me. You know that feeling you get when someone is staring at you for too long? That prickling sensation on the back of your neck that you can't quite shake. Yeah, that. It was just like that. I glanced over and saw him. A man standing at the window of a small, run-down house near the end of a block. He was tall, with a thin frame, and his face was obscured by the curtain he was peeking through. But what I could see of his face, those cold, unblinking eyes, sent a chill down my spine. He didn't move, he just watched me. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe he was just bored or nosy. I tried not to think about it as I finished my walk with Rusty. But the next morning, here he was again. And the morning after that. Every time I passed by, those same eyes would be staring at me from behind the curtain. No expression, no wave, just that unsettling stare. It was as if he had nothing better to do than watch me walk my dog. After a couple of weeks, it became impossible to ignore. I started changing my route, taking different streets, hoping to avoid the house entirely. But whenever I happened to pass by, even by accident, he was there, always watching. Rusty, bless his heart, didn't seem to notice, but I did. I started feeling uneasy, and even a little paranoid, wondering if he was keeping track of my every movement. I mean, who was this guy? And why was he even staring at me? I never saw him leave the house. Never saw any lights on at night, and I didn't know his name. He just stood there, kind of like a shadow. One morning, about 6 months into this routine, things escalated. It was a Saturday, and I had slept in a bit, deciding to take Rusty for a later walk. The sun was already up, casting long shadows on the sidewalk, and the air was crisp with the promise of an approaching autumn. I wasn't even thinking about him as we walked. My mind was preoccupied with weekend plans. But as we approached his house, something caught my attention. He wasn't standing at the window this time. Instead, he was standing outside, leaning against the fence that bordered his yard, waiting. I felt my heart skip a beat. Rusty, oblivious as always, tugged at the leash, eager to keep going. But I slowed down, my pulse quickening as I realized there would be no avoiding him this time. As I got closer, I noticed the way he was watching me, his eyes following every step I took.
Good morning.
He called out, his voice low and raspy. I nodded, trying to be polite, but quick. Morning, I muttered, trying not to make eye contact. Rusty sniffed at the ground as we walked past, but just as I thought I was in the clear, the man spoke again.
You know, I've been watching you for a while now.
I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. What was I supposed to say to that? Before I could think of an answer, he continued, stepping closer to the sidewalk.
You and your dog, you always seem so peaceful, like you've got no worries.
He paused, a strange smile spreading across his face, but it didn't reach his eyes.
I was wondering if you'd like to come inside, have a cup of coffee. I've got something I think you'll want to see.
Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out of there. The way he said it, the way he smiled, there was something profoundly wrong. It wasn't just creepy, it was dangerous. I could feel it. Uh, no thanks, I said, forcing a laugh that came out shaky. I've got to get going. Maybe another time. His smile faltered and his eyes darkened, but he didn't say anything. He just watched me as I hurried away, Rusty trotting along at my side. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I didn't look back, even though I could feel his eyes on me until I turned the corner. I didn't sleep well that night. The man's words, his stare, and the invitation, it all played over and over again in my mind. I could not get rid of the thought that something was very, very wrong. The next morning, I was determined to avoid his street entirely. I took Rusty in the opposite direction, not even daring to glance toward Maple Avenue. But when I returned home later that day, something strange happened. There were cop cars on the street. They were parked outside his house, several of them, with officers standing around, talking to each other, and looking grim. I couldn't help my curiosity. I asked a neighbor what was going on, and she told me that the man had moved out. Suddenly, just packed up and left. But that wasn't the strange part. The police had raided his house, and according to the neighbor, they found something horrible inside. Human-sized cages, she whispered, her face pale. They were in the basement, like he was planning something. My stomach turned. Human-sized cages? I could barely wrap my mind around it. The man who had watched me for months, who had tried to lure me into his house, he had cages? I thought back to that morning when he had invited me in. What would have happened if I had said yes? I never saw him after that again. The house stayed empty for a while. Then eventually someone new moved in, and the neighborhood went back to normal. But I couldn't forget. Every time I walked Rusty past that house, I think about the cages, the invitation, and the feeling of his eyes on me. I was lucky, I tell myself. So lucky. Because sometimes things aren't just creepy, they're dangerous. Theater class was always my sanctuary. The thrill of becoming someone else, the rush of performing under the stage lights, and the camaraderie with my classmates made it the highlight of my day. I loved everything about it. The rehearsals, the costumes, and even the odd little quirks of our drama room. But there was one thing that always gave me an uneasy feeling. The mannequin. The mannequin stood in the corner of the room, almost like a silent observer to our daily antics. It was one of those old-fashioned, featureless mannequins, the kind you'd see in a department store from the 1950s. Over the years, we had dressed it up in all sorts of costumes, from medieval armor to clown outfits, depending on the play we were working on. It was part of the fun, a tradition even, but recently, something about it started to feel off. I couldn't pinpoint when it began, but I noticed the strange vibes whenever I looked at it. It was always in the same spot, yet sometimes it felt like it was watching us, its blank face following our movements. I brushed it off as my imagination after all. It was just a mannequin. One afternoon after class, the teacher, Mrs. Parker, asked me to stay behind to help organize the costumes for our upcoming play. The room had emptied out quickly, my classmates eager to head home, leaving just me and the mannequin. I felt a small knot of unease in my stomach as I began sorting through the racks of costumes, the mannequin standing ominously nearby in its usual place. As I worked, I kept stealing glances at it. At one point, I noticed something odd. It seemed to have shifted slightly. Just a small turn of the head or a different angle in its stance. Nothing too obvious, but enough to make me stop and stare. I could have sworn it had been facing the other direction earlier. I tried to focus on my task, telling myself that it was just my nerves getting the better of me. But then I noticed something even stranger. The mannequin was now wearing a costume that I didn't recognize. It was a Victorian era Shakespeare like garb, something we hadn't used in class that day. In fact, the last I remembered, it had been wearing a silly jester's outfit from yesterday's rehearsal. I felt chills go up my back. I hadn't dressed it, and I was certain no one else had either. I moved closer to inspect it, feeling a mix of dread and curiosity. As I reached out to touch the cloak, a loud creak echoed through the room. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, a rat fell from the leg garb of the mannequin, scurrying across the floor. I let out a yelp, stumbling backwards in fright. The rat disappeared under a nearby rack of clothes, leaving me shaken and breathless. Trying to compose myself, I cautiously approached the mannequin again, but nothing seemed out of place. The rat was gone, and the mannequin was still in its odd new costume. I finished my task as quickly as possible, my nerves on edge the entire time. As soon as I was done, I bolted out of the room, not daring to look back. The next day, I was reluctant to enter the drama room, but classes went on as usual. The mannequin, however, was back in its original position, wearing the jester's outfit it had worn before. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the eerie events of the previous day were all in my head. I discreetly checked the mannequin for any gaps or holes where the rat could have been, but there was nothing. The mannequin was solid, no place for a rat to hide. I asked around, but no one else had seen a rat, and Miss Parker said she hadn't changed the costume since our last class. The whole experience left me feeling uneasy. From that day on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right with that mannequin. I avoided it whenever I could, refusing to be alone in the room with it again. Even though it had never moved or changed costumes again, the memory of that day haunted me. College was supposed to be a fresh start. New faces, new classes, and new experiences. I was excited, eager to dive into my studies and make new friends. When I first met my roommate, Dale, I didn't think much of it. He seemed normal enough. Quiet, reserved, and from another country, which wasn't unusual at a university like ours. We were both the same age, but that was about where our similarities ended. Dale didn't say much during our first few days living together. He wore a worn-out backpack everywhere, leaving at odd times, often well into the night. I figured maybe he had a strange schedule or a job off campus, but I quickly noticed something didn't add up. He never talked about school, classes, or any professors. In fact, I started to suspect he wasn't even enrolled at the university at all. He just existed in our shared space, disappearing for hours at a time with his backpack slung over his shoulder, and returning quietly, sometimes long after midnight. But it was the little things that started to make me uncomfortable. Dale had this bizarre habit with milk. He'd buy a carton, drink most of it, and then leave just a tiny bit, barely a few sips left in the fridge. He'd never throw out the old milk. Instead, he'd buy more, and the old carton would sit there for days, then weeks, going rancid. The smell would eventually take over the entire fridge, so I'd have to toss it out myself. It wasn't just milk either. He'd leave half-eaten meat, deli slices, and things that would rot quickly in the back of the fridge until it smelled like death. When I asked him about it, he'd shrug like it didn't matter. Dale also had this strange way of making everything seem like my fault. I'd be studying in the living room and he'd come in and complain that I was too loud, when I wasn't even making noise. I'd clean the kitchen and he'd get irritated that I had moved his disgusting leftover food. One day I was washing dishes and he yelled at me, insisting I was disturbing the spirits of the house. I had no idea what he meant, but his tone was menacing, and his eyes were wild. Something about him made my skin crawl, like there was something much darker beneath his quiet exterior. The tension kept building until one day I saw something that made my blood run cold. Dale's room always smelled terrible. It was worse than the fridge. A mix of rotting food and something else. Something metallic and foul. He usually kept his door shut, but one day when he was out, the smell was so overpowering that I couldn't help but investigate. The door was slightly ajar, so I pushed it open and stepped inside. What I saw immediately made me regret going in. The room was a mess. Clothes, food, wrappers, and notebooks scattered everywhere. The smell hit me like a brick wall. But the thing that stood out the most were the thumb drives. Dozens of them. Neatly laid out on his desk. Each one labeled with a different color. Some said work. Others had names on them I didn't recognize. But one caught my eye. It was plugged into his laptop, the screen still on. The drive was labeled fun. Curiosity got the better of me, and I inched closer, trying to see what was on the screen. Before I could touch anything, I heard the door slam downstairs. My heart raced as I quickly stepped out of his room and tried to act like I hadn't seen anything. I went into the kitchen, pretending to be busy, when Dale burst in. His eyes were frantic, darting from me to the hallway.
Were you in my room?
He demanded, his voice low but shaking with barely contained rage. I tried to play it cool, but my voice betrayed me.
I just noticed your door was open. I didn't go in.
Dale's face twisted with fury. He started shouting at me in a language I didn't understand, his words sharp and angry. He was pacing back and forth, muttering under his breath, his fists clenched. I had no idea what he was saying, but the tone was unmistakable. He was furious, and I had crossed the line. That night, I called my friend Matt and told him everything. The strange behavior, the milk, the thumb drives. Matt didn't hesitate.
Dude, you need to get out of there. Break your lease if you have to. This guy sounds dangerous.
It didn't take much convincing. The next morning, I went to the leasing office and arranged to move out early. I packed my things quickly, avoiding Dale as much as possible. He seemed quieter than usual, but his eyes followed me everywhere. I couldn't wait to be gone. 2 weeks after I moved out, I got a call from Matt. His voice was shaky.
Did you hear about Dale?
He asked. No, I said, suddenly on edge. What happened?
He attacked somebody in the park near campus. The cops arrested him, but that's not all. They searched his room, man. They found stuff.
I pressed him for details, my stomach twisting with dread.
They found thumb drives.
Matt said, his voice barely a whisper.
Dozens of them. And some kind of ritual. He was using the milk for it. Something he called a ritual of milk. Dude, the worst part, they found human remains. He was trying to use parts of the people in these rituals, and he recorded it all on those thumb drives.
I felt like I was going to be sick. The drives, the strange smell in his room, the way he acted, it all made sense now. In the most horrifying way possible. I had lived with a monster, and I hadn't even known it. Dale vanished from my life after that. I never heard from him again, but I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to getting caught up in something far darker than I ever imagined. I was just glad I got out when I did.
Thanks for joining. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. as well as leave a comment and let me know what you thought of everything. Also, if you have any story ideas or would like me to read any of your stories, please feel free to contact me at my email in the description. Once again, thank you for joining, and I'll catch you again next time here at Startle Volumes.